In January of 1983, a 13-year-old boy stood in a courtroom in Honolulu, Hawaii, and listened to a judge tell him that if he appeared in that courtroom one more time, his next stop would not be a juvenile facility. It would be prison. The boy standing in that courtroom was not a bad kid. He was not evil. He was not broken beyond repair. He was a child who had grown up watching the adults around him struggle and fail and disappear, and who had decided somewhere in the unformed logic of early adolescence that the rules were for people who had something to protect and he had nothing. He had been arrested multiple times. Theft, fighting, running with a crew in Honolulu that was heading in one direction only. His family had moved 14 times in 14 years, chasing work that never quite paid enough and stability that never quite held. He had attended a different school almost every year of his life. He had no permanent friendships, no permanent community, no permanent anything except the particular kind of hardness that children develop when the world keeps pulling the rug from under them before they have learned to stand properly. He walked out of that courtroom and went home to an apartment where the electricity had been cut off because the bill had not been paid. His mother was sitting in the dark. He sat beside her in the silence, and in that moment, a 13-year-old boy in a dark apartment in Hawaii with a criminal record and no clear idea of what his life was supposed to become, something shifted. He did not know yet what he was going to build. He did not have a plan or a vision or a roadmap. What he had was a feeling so specific and so powerful that he has described it in almost identical terms every time he has spoken about that night in the decades since. He was not going to let his mother sit in the dark anymore. Today, Dwayne Johnson is the highest paid actor on earth. He has built a personal brand worth over $800 million. He has starred in some of the highest grossing film franchises in the history of Hollywood. He has built a tequila company, a fitness brand, a production company, and a media empire that generates hundreds of millions of dollars annually. He is one of the most followed human beings on the planet, with hundreds of millions of social media followers across every platform. And it all started with a 13-year-old boy sitting in the dark next to his mother with $7 in his pocket and a choice that most people in that situation never find the clarity to make. If this opening just reached something inside you, if you already feel that this story is going to hit different from anything you have heard before, then subscribe to Billionaire Blueprint right now. Before we go any further, because every single week we bring you the real stories of the men and women who started with nothing and built everything. And this one is one of the most extraordinary transformations in the history of human achievement. Now let us go back to the very beginning. Dwayne Douglas Johnson was born on May 2, 1972 in Hayward, California. His father, Rocky Johnson, was a professional wrestler, one of the first black wrestlers to win major titles in an era when the industry was deeply segregated and the barriers facing black athletes were not just competitive, but cultural and institutional. His mother, Eta, was the daughter of High Chief Peter Maivia, a Samoan wrestling legend whose name still carries enormous weight in the professional wrestling world. Wrestling was not just a profession in the Johnson family. It was identity. It was heritage. It was the thing that defined who they were and how they moved through the world. But the wrestling life was not a stable life. It was a traveling life, a life of living out of bags and moving between cities and towns, following the circuit, chasing bookings, building a career in an industry that chewed up most of the people who entered it and gave almost nothing back to the ones it discarded. Dwayne moved 14 times before he was 14 years old. Think about what that means for a child. 14 schools, 14 sets of classrooms to navigate as the new kid, 14 neighborhoods where the social hierarchies were already established and the outsider had to figure out quickly how to find their place or pay the price for failing to do so. 14 moments of leaving behind whatever friendships and familiarity had barely started to form. Most children would have become withdrawn under that kind of constant uprooting. Dwayne became something different. He became hyper-adaptive, developing a social intelligence born not from privilege and comfort, but from necessity. He learned to read rooms instantly, to understand social dynamics faster than most people because he had no choice, to make people comfortable with him quickly because quick was the only timeline he ever had. These skills, reading people, commanding a room, making strangers feel immediately at ease, would eventually make him one of the most charismatic entertainers on earth. But at 13, they were just survival tools in a life that kept demanding he survive. The family was living in Honolulu, Hawaii, when things fell apart most dramatically. His father was on the road constantly. The money was inconsistent, the bills piled up, and Dwayne, a large, physically imposing 13-year-old with too much energy, too much anger, and not enough structure, found his way into trouble with a speed and thoroughness that alarmed everyone who cared about him. He was arrested multiple times. He fell in with a group of older boys who were shoplifting regularly from local stores, not for thrill, but for survival, and for the particular status that comes from being part of something in a world where you belong to nothing. He was picked up by police on multiple occasions, and then came that courtroom, that judge, that warning that the next stop would be prison, and then that dark apartment, his mother beside him, $7 in his pocket. The shift that happened in Dwayne Johnson that night was not dramatic in the way that movie transformations are dramatic. There was no single moment of blazing clarity. There was no voice from heaven. There was just a 14-year-old boy making a quiet internal decision that the life he was heading toward was not the life he was going to live. His father, Rocky, came back into the picture around this time, and the relationship complicated, difficult, demanding in the way that relationships with hard men who love you but do not know how to show it are always complicated and difficult, gave Dwayne something he desperately needed, a direction. Rocky Johnson was a disciplined man in the way that professional athletes are disciplined, not because discipline was comfortable, but because discipline was the only thing standing between them and failure in a profession that gave nothing to the unprepared. He began training his son, not gently, not encouragingly in the way of modern youth coaching, hard, demanding, with expectations that assumed the boy was capable of far more than he was currently delivering. Dwayne responded. The gym became his sanctuary in the same way that the streets had been his danger zone. It was a place where effort had a direct and immediate relationship with result, where the work you put in showed up in your body, in your strength, in your capability, in a way that nothing else in his chaotic life ever had. The gym was honest. The gym did not move. The gym did not cut off the electricity or pack up and relocate to another city. The gym was the first permanent thing he had ever had. By the time he was in high school at McKinley High in Honolulu, he was a physical phenomenon. 6'2", 220 pounds of muscle at 15 years old, a natural athlete of such obvious ability that college recruiters started paying attention before he had even finished his sophomore year. He became one of the most recruited high school football players in America. The University of Miami, one of the most prestigious football programs in the country at the time, offered him a full scholarship. He accepted. At the University of Miami, Dwayne Johnson was surrounded by some of the most talented college football players in America. Players who would go on to NFL careers. Players who had been the best on every team they had ever played for. Players who arrived in Miami with the absolute certainty that professional football was their destiny. Dwayne was one of the best among them. He played defensive tackle. He was ferocious, powerful, technically sound, and driven with the specific intensity of a person who had seen the alternative to success up close and had absolutely no interest in returning to it. Miami won the national championship in 1991. Dwayne Johnson was part of that team. He was part of what many consider the greatest college football team ever assembled, a team so dominant and so talented that it rewrote what people believed was possible in college football. And then the NFL draft came. Dwayne Johnson was not selected. Not in the first round, not in the second, not in any round. The same player who had won a national championship with one of the greatest college football teams in history went through the entire NFL draft without a single team calling his name. The rejection was crushing in the specific way that only public rejection in front of everyone who believed in you can be crushing. Every person who had watched him play, every coach who had recruited him, every teammate who had assumed he was headed to the league. All of them witnesses to the silence where his name should have been called. He was given a tryout by the Calgary Stampeders in the Canadian Football League. He made the practice squad. He was earning $400 per week. He was 23 years old, living in a strange city, playing on a practice squad in a league that most Americans had never watched, wondering if everything he had worked for had added up to nothing. He was cut from the practice squad before the season ended. He flew back to Tampa, Florida, where his parents were living. He arrived with $7 in his pocket. Literally, $7. He moved back into his parents' house. He sat with the complete and total collapse of the dream he had spent his entire life building and tried to figure out what came next. He later described those weeks as the darkest period of his life. Not the poverty of his childhood, not the arrests, not the courtroom. The weeks after being cut from the CFL practice squad, because those earlier hardships had happened before he knew what he was capable of. This happened after. This happened when he had worked as hard as a human being could work and given everything he had, and the dream had still not come together. He was sitting in darkness again. Different apartment, same darkness. And then his father walked in and said something that Dwayne Johnson has quoted in interviews for the rest of his life. Rocky Johnson looked at his son and said, "You have to find your own thing now." And then he said something harder. He said that football was my thing, and it was never going to be yours. It was brutal. It was honest. And it was exactly what Dwayne Johnson needed to hear. He turned to wrestling. Not because he was passionate about it in the way he had been passionate about football, but because it was the only other world he knew. Because his father and his grandfather had built careers in it, because he was physically extraordinary, and because the family connections could get him in the door. He debuted in the WWF, now WWE, in 1996 under his own name, Dwayne Johnson. The crowd did not respond. The character was flat. The connection between the performer and the audience was not there. He was booed not in the way that villain characters are strategically booed, but in the way that crowds boo when they are bored and unimpressed. The WWE creative team made a decision that would accidentally produce one of the greatest characters in the history of professional entertainment. They turned him heel. They gave him a character called The Rock, an arrogant, trash-talking third-generation wrestler who referred to himself in the third person, who had a list of catchphrases that nobody had heard before, who interacted with the audience with a charisma and a comedic timing that came from somewhere deep inside the same hyper-adaptive social intelligence that 14-year-old Dwayne had developed, moving between 14 schools in 14 cities. The crowd that had booed Dwayne Johnson began to cheer The Rock. Then they began to love The Rock. Then they began to worship The Rock. Within 2 years of his debut, Dwayne Johnson had become the most electrifying man in sports entertainment, his own phrase, delivered with the specific cadence and confidence of a man who had found the thing he was born to do and was doing it at full capacity for the first time in his life. He won the WWF Championship 8 times. He became the face of the most watched era in professional wrestling history, the Attitude Era, alongside Stone Cold Steve Austin, in a rivalry that drew television audiences of 15 to 20 million viewers every single Monday night. He was selling out arenas across America. He was on magazine covers. He was becoming famous in the way that only a very specific combination of physicality, charisma, and timing can make a person famous. And then he looked at Hollywood. The transition from professional wrestling to serious Hollywood acting was a road littered with the failed careers of every wrestler who had tried it before him. The industry assumption was that wrestlers could not act, that the pantomime of the ring did not translate to the screen, that audiences would never accept a man known for scripted athletic entertainment as a genuine movie star. Dwayne Johnson did not argue with the assumption, he just proved it wrong. He made his first significant film appearance in The Mummy Returns in 2001, a small role that was on screen for less than 5 minutes, but generated so much audience response that Universal Pictures immediately greenlit a spin-off film built entirely around his character. That film was The Scorpion King. It was released in 2002. It made $165 million at the global box office. Dwayne Johnson was paid $5.5 million for the role, a world record at the time for an actor in their first leading role. He was 30 years old. He had gone from $7 in his pocket and a cut from a CFL practice squad to a Hollywood leading man in 7 years. But he was just getting started. The films kept coming. The Fast and Furious franchise, Jumanji, Moana, Baywatch, Central Intelligence, Hobbs and Shaw, Red Notice, Black Adam, each one adding to a filmography that demonstrated a range that his critics had insisted he did not have: action, comedy, family films, animation, superhero movies. He was not a one-note performer. He was a genuine movie star in the fullest and most traditional sense of the phrase. By 2016, he was the highest-paid actor in Hollywood, earning approximately $64 million in a single year. He held that position for years, not because the studios had no choice, but because audiences kept choosing him, kept buying tickets for his films, kept watching his content, kept following his journey with a loyalty that most entertainers spend entire careers trying to build and never fully achieve. The reason they followed him was not just talent, it was authenticity. Dwayne Johnson became one of the first major celebrities to use social media not as a promotional tool, but as a genuine window into his life and his process. His early morning workouts posted at 4 a.m., his failures shared as openly as his successes, his relationship with his daughters documented with a warmth and vulnerability that the hyper-masculine image of The Rock made startlingly unexpected, his connection to his Samoan heritage expressed with a pride and a depth that resonated with millions of people from cultures where that kind of pride was not always given space in mainstream entertainment. He was not performing authenticity, he was authentic, because the man who had sat in a dark apartment at 13 and a dark room at 23 had done too much real living to pretend that success was anything other than what it actually was. The product of work and hunger and the refusal to stay down when the world knocked you to the floor. He launched Teremana Tequila in 2020. It became one of the fastest growing spirit brands in the history of the industry, selling over 600,000 cases in its first year, a record that no other celebrity spirits brand had come close to matching. He launched a production company. He launched a fitness brand. He launched a media partnership with NBC for a football league called the XFL, the sport that had rejected him, now coming back to him on his terms. He built not just a career, but an empire. Not just an empire, but a movement. A genuine cultural force built on the specific foundation of a 13-year-old boy who decided in the dark that the life he was heading toward was not the life he was going to live. Today, Dwayne Johnson is worth approximately $800 million and rising. He employs hundreds of people across his various business ventures. He is one of the most philanthropic entertainers in Hollywood, giving back to communities and causes with a generosity that comes directly from the specific knowledge of what it feels like to have nothing. He still trains at 4 a.m. every morning, not because he has to, because the discipline that saved his life at 13 is not something he is willing to put down even now that the reasons for desperation are long gone, because he understands something that most people who achieve extraordinary success eventually forget. The hunger is not the enemy of the good life. The hunger is the engine of it. But here is what I need you to understand before this video ends. Dwayne Johnson did not build his empire despite the $7 and the dark apartment and the failed football dream and the CFL cut and the booing crowds. He built it because of them. Every single one of those moments was not a detour from the path to success. Every single one of them was the path. The arrest taught him that the rules existed for a reason and that breaking them had a cost he was not willing to keep paying. The moving taught him to read people and rooms and social dynamics with a speed and accuracy that made him magnetic in every environment he entered. The football rejection taught him that the dream you are most attached to is not always the dream that was made for you, and that the willingness to release it and find the right one is not weakness, but wisdom. The booing crowds taught him that the version of yourself that the world first sees is not always the version you are capable of becoming, and that the gap between them is closed not by changing who you are, but by finding the most powerful and authentic expression of it. And the dark apartment, both of them, the one at 13 and the one at 23, taught him that darkness is not permanent, that sitting in the dark does not mean the light is not coming, that the question is never whether the light will come back. The question is whether you will still be there when it does. You are still here. That means the light is coming for you too. If this story reached something real inside you, if it reminded you that your worst moment is not your final moment and that everything you have survived has been preparation for everything you are about to build, then do one thing right now. Subscribe to Billionaire Blueprint. Because what we are building on this channel is not just a collection of success stories, it is a library of proof. Proof that the place you started has no power over the place you finish. Proof that rejection is not the end of the story. Proof that the hunger you feel right now, the specific uncomfortable, will not leave you alone. Hunger that brought you to this video is not a problem to be solved. It is the most valuable thing you own. Subscribe, stay with us, and let us build something extraordinary together.